Okay, this is another reaction video. This is to Steve Shives. Was Star Trek's Maquis justified? This is a little bit different. Normally I do football or soccer, but this time I'm going to do
In
Star Trek.
1943, the Vichy government of Nazi-occupied France enacted the policy of Service du Travail Obligatoire, or compulsory work service, which conscripted hundreds of thousands of French citizens to perform forced labor in furtherance of the German war effort. Tens of thousands of French, mostly young men who were leftists, anti-fascists, members of the working class, resisted conscription and escaped to the wilderness of western and southern France, where they formed guerrilla bands to attack and harass the Nazis and their French collaborators. These resistance fighters were named for the rough, inhospitable land in which they made their bases of operation. In French, they were called the Maquis.
Now, the Maquis, now Hitler hated the communists, hated the left with a passion. And so they were definitely enemies of the Nazis. And they were living in occupied territory with the Nazis France had surrendered in 1940. And Hitler's hatred of the communists led to his attack of the Soviet Union, which had devastating consequences. But let's move on.
It's kind of difficult to argue that the original Maquis, the real Maquis, weren't on the right side of that conflict.
They most definitely were.
Some might question their tactics, their effectiveness, their impact on the overall outcome of the war, but they were definitely the good guys. Unless you're a Nazi, in which case... But...
Well, I think everybody feels that way about the Nazis, except if you are a Nazi, but I'm not going to give the bird to the Nazis. Not necessary.
The same question doesn't have nearly so clear an answer when we apply it to the fictional namesake of the Maquis in Star Trek. But we shouldn't expect anything else, since the Maquis were introduced in Star Trek Deep Space Nine, and the most interesting episodes to feature them are found in that series. In the world of Deep Space Nine, moral ambiguity isn't just something people occasionally have to deal with. It's a way of life unto itself. Even though the Maquis were officially introduced on Deep Space Nine, the circumstances that led to their emergence were set up on Star Trek The Next Generation.
Now, the first time we saw the Cardassians, it was on Star Trek The Next Generation, was an episode of the fourth season called The Wounded. And then we would find out about the Bajorans in an episode of the fifth season called Ensign Rowe. The one he's talking about, or going to be talking about, is Journey's End, the seventh season, which brought back, among all things, Wesley Crusher. But the main story there were two main stories. One was Wesley Crusher, but the real story that he's talking about is the Native Americans that were on the planet that was ceded to the Cardassians,
where things were a lot less morally ambiguous. In the seventh season TNG episode Journey's End, Captain Picard is ordered to relocate a Federation colony from a planet that has been ceded to the Cardassians as part of a new peace treaty. Two more important details about that. One, the colonists don't want to be relocated, and two, they're descendants of Native Americans who came to this planet in the first place, hoping to forever leave behind their people's sad...
And if you think that was an accident, that's where fictional worlds and where writers come in. That this just happens to be a planet which has Native Americans who historically were removed from their own lands by the American government, and now they're on another planet in the Star Trek universe, and they're quote-unquote, being removed again.
History of persecution and forced relocation. So, hey, good luck with that, Captain Picard. Let me know how that turns out. Admiral Nechayev emphasizes to Picard that this peace treaty with the Cardassians is the product of lengthy and difficult negotiations. And while the terms are not ideal, this is the agreement that both sides have reached. And it will mean peace between the Federation and the Cardassians. For this reason, though reluctant and extremely conflicted, Picard appears willing to force the colonists to leave. But at the end of the episode, a compromise is reached. The colonists will be allowed to stay on their planets, but they must agree to live under Cardassian authority.
Now, if this was a real life situation, this is fictional, obviously, but if this was a real life situation and you would know who the Cardassians were and what they're about, would you absolutely trust that they would keep their word? Would you say, I'm going to stay here under their rule because at the end, Gulliver over there says that he can't speak for every Cardassian, but you'll think they'll leave him alone. Do you really think they're going to leave him alone? Would you take their word on that? I mean, the way the episode pans out, it's meant to show in a way that Picard doesn't have to forcibly move them. A compromise, an agreement is made. But if this was real life, if this was a real situation, would you think these Native Americans would stay under Cardassian rule?
And to give up the protections of Federation citizenship. The Native American descendants aren't the only ones to accept that compromise. Colonists from other former Federation planets that have been transferred to the Cardassians by the treaty also choose to stay under Cardassian authority rather than relocate. For their part, the Cardassians promise to leave the colonists alone. But when we return to these colonies about a month later on Deep Space Nine, we learn that, surprise, the Cardassians have not been leaving the colonists alone. In fact,
and never had any intention of doing so.
It turns out elements within the Cardassian government have been secretly arming Cardassian colonists in the region who have then been attacking the former Federation colonists in an attempt to drive them out. Some of the former Federation colonists, including many Starfleet officers, or soon-to-be former Starfleet officers, I guess, have...
That's Cal Hudson, played by Bernie Casey in this episode, what you're looking at right there. The other people, Ensign Rowe would join the Maquis, and so would Michael Eddington. So would... trying to think, who else did I remember seeing join the Maquis? Oh, Chakotay, which set up Star Trek Voyager, also joined the Maquis.
Formed a resistance group to fight back against the Cardassians. They've staged guerrilla attacks against Cardassian ships, blown up freighters suspected of carrying weapons meant to be used against them. They even kidnapped Gul Dukat. Oh no, not Gul Dukat. Please give him back. And they call themselves the Maquis. So, a band of resistance fighters, sold out and abandoned by their supposedly altruistic former government, rebelling against violent fascists who have occupied their land.
Keep in mind something. They are never specifically called fascists. Not that I'm defending fascism by any stretch of the imagination, but the Cardassian government is never specifically described that I can recall as being a fascist government. Now, he's going to call them a fascist government, but I don't recall them being labeled as such.
These Maquis are obviously the good guys too, right? Maybe. It depends on how you look at it. And for me, specifically, it depends on how you read the Maquis. Am I judging them based on what they represent metaphorically? Or am I judging them based on the literal circumstances of their fictional world? If I'm judging them based on what they represent in the story, then yeah, obviously they're the good guys, because their name and the situation they find themselves in, broadly speaking, mark them as stand-ins for real-life bands of freedom fighters, like the Maquis, the German anti-fascists of the 1930s, and other organizations that have resisted authoritarian governments throughout history. Read this way, the Maquis compels us to question the inherent goodness of the Federation and Starfleet. Because, remember, when we see the Maquis, the focus is usually not on their conflict with the Cardassians, but on how that conflict threatens the Federation and the peace treaty. Getting us to question our assumptions about the Federation and Starfleet is kind of Deep Space Nine's whole thing. The Federation and Starfleet are still the good guys, generally speaking, but that doesn't mean everything they do is good.
It's not a black and white situation when you watch Deep Space Nine. When you watch the original series, Star Trek and the Next Generation, you were looking at it purely from a Federation point of view. The Federation was good. This is why we're doing it, and you agree or disagree. You make your determinations that way. Deep Space Nine didn't make it so black and white. They put a little gray area there, and you could see both sides. And the Maquis really played out that way in Deep Space Nine. But the difference, as he's going to point out, these people decide to say, it's almost like the Nazis said, we're going to come over and we're going to take over France, but if you want to leave, you want to go someplace else, you can. And they decided to stay under Nazi rule. That's not how it happened historically. But that in Deep Space Nine, the Maquis made their own determination. They said they were going to stay under Cardassian rule. Okay, that was their decision to make. And the Federation offered to move them to another planet. And they did not move. They stayed there under Cardassian rule. And the result, and they again trusted the Cardassians were going to not mess with them. Okay, like I said, think of that from a realistic point of view. And you knew who the Cardassians were before you made that agreement. It's not like the Cardassians came in, didn't know who they were, didn't know who these people were, didn't know what they were about. And you were taking a leap of faith. You knew who they were about.
Or that they're always acting in everyone's best interests. Throughout Deep Space Nine's run, and particularly in the episodes depicting the Maquis, we see how Federation policies and Starfleet actions can bring about some pretty destructive consequences. Yes, the Maquis are violent outlaws, but Deep Space Nine reminds us again and again, let's not forget what created the Maquis in the first place. A peace treaty signed between two powerful empires, one of which is nominally benevolent, which regards people's homes as assets to be traded. So that's the metaphorical interpretation. And by that reading, for me, the Maquis are clearly the good guys in their conflicts with the Cardassians and the Federation, and are morally justified in their actions because they stand for resistance against fascism and government authority wielded.
Again, not specifically stated that this was a fascist government by the Cardassians. That was an authoritative government, yes, but not specifically stated to be fascism. Again, look, Spain was a fascist country. Okay, but they didn't invade anybody. There's no concentration camps there. But again, he's calling it a fascist government. There was nothing specifically stated that the Cardassians were a fascist government. They may have been, but I don't ever recall it actually specifically saying it was a fascist government.
Wielded in a way that callously disregards the rights of the people under its power. But if we read the Maquis more literally, things look very different. Here's the situation in literal terms that exists in the fictional world of Star Trek around the time of the formation of the Maquis. The Federation and the Cardassians have been at war at some time in the recent past, but now they've spent the last little while hammering out an agreement to secure a stable peace that both sides will be able to live with. One of the concessions the Federation made to Cardassia was to give up certain planets along the border. Under the terms of the treaty, those planets become Cardassian planets. As a result, the Federation colonists on those planets need to be relocated. Now, is it fair to those colonists that they're being forced to leave their home?
Of course it's not fair. We know it's not fair. You've lived in your house. It's your house. You went there. It was an unclaimed planet. Happened to be on the border with Cardassia, but it was in Federation space. It was your own planet, your own home, your place to live. You created it, and you nobody was there. You went there, you lived there, you created a life for yourself there. It's not fair for somebody to come in who didn't do what you did. And we specifically said it in the episode, The Maquis, where Cal Hudson says to Ben Sisko about one of the people that was murdered. I think it was Ben. Forget his name. I'm not going to try and remember it off the top of my head, but he said he built a home there, farmed the land there, cultivated the land there, raised 2 daughters there, and he wasn't prepared to give it up.
Homes? No. Is it an indication that Federation society is not quite the utopia that it's usually depicted as? Yes. But is it a reason to resign from Starfleet and take up arms? I kinda don't think it is. The colonists on the planet in question have every right to be upset, and I'm sure, even with the advanced technology at their disposal, that moving from one planet to another on relatively short notice will be a hardship for many of them, physically and emotionally. Humans, as most of the Maquis members seem to be, are sentimental creatures, and we get attached to places, and we get upset when someone comes in and tells us we have to leave because people in power made a decision without even running it by us first. But the Federation is offering to move them to new planets. The Federation economy operates without money, so expense isn't an issue, and this is all being done in order to end what we are told has been a devastating and destructive war, albeit one that took place entirely off-screen.
Yeah, that is true. We never did see the war that we're talking about here. And this demilitarization zone that they're going to create in the story is okay. You know, it's to push the story forward. I get that, but that's what they're doing here.
Because by the time the writers made it up, it was already over. These colonists aren't in territory that was captured and occupied by the Cardassians during the war. They aren't being drafted to do forced labor for the...
And that's a key distinction. You know, they made the decision, like I said earlier, they made the decision to stay where they were under Cardassian rule. That was their decision to make. They could have left. The Federation would have found them another place to live. They chose to stay behind.
The Cardassians, as was done to the real Maquis by the Nazis. Yes, by the time the Maquis begin operating on Deep Space Nine, they are under Cardassian authority, and they are fighting back against violence and harassment they're experiencing under the Cardassians.
Which is something you really don't see in the story, okay? You don't know that once the treaty is signed, once it's there, you don't see a situation where the Federation, where the Cardassians are going there, harassing them and causing problems. We know that the Central Command of Cardassia was feeding weapons to the Cardassian people. We know that based on the story. But we don't see what the Cardassians are doing to the Federation colonists who stay behind.
But unlike the people of occupied France, the people who chose to stay on those planets are not prisoners. They're still free to leave and take up the Federation's offer to be relocated to planets outside Cardassian territory. So while they call themselves the Maquis, the circumstances that lead to their rebellion on TNG and Deep Space Nine are significantly different from those that created the Maquis in France during World War II. In fact, I think that may be why, in Journey's End, the TNG episode that kicked off the Maquis storyline, the colonists who resisted relocation were depicted as being Native American, because without that link to a very specific...
Again, that was not a mistake by the writers. You know, you could have told this story with anybody, just a normal Federation colony with Vulcans, Andorians, Tellarites, Beta Zeds, whoever you want. You could have put anybody there and say, we're going to move you or forcibly relocate you. It was not a mistake that they chose to put Native Americans in this circumstance. This is what the writers did.
Tragic and inexcusable real-life forced relocation, it would be obvious that these colonists don't really have a leg to stand on. The Federation isn't forcing the Native Americans off their land so they can settle white people there, and they aren't trying to dilute or destroy their culture. Nor are these colonists being forced out of their homes for some secret or nefarious purpose by an evil admiral, as is the case in Star Trek Insurrection.
Yeah, this is like I said prior to this, if this was real life, if this was a real story, if we're talking about history here, something that actually happened in space history, okay, whatever you call it, space history, whatever you want to call it, would the people that were there on the Native American colony, would they trust the Cardassians? Would they trust the Cardassians to keep their word? Okay? If you can build a life on one planet, you can build it on another. Okay? Now, I understand during the story that the leader said that this was their land, this was their sacred land, this called to them, and so forth. But do you think that person would really trust the Cardassians? Would you trust the Cardassians if you knew who they were?
They have to leave because their planets have been given away as part of a peace treaty, and that sucks for them, and I'm sympathetic to them.
And anybody would be sympathetic because that is the bottom line in the whole thing, is that a decision was made to give away your home pretty much without you having a say in it. I know that Nechayev says in the episode that a representative was there and it was considered, but that doesn't mean anything at that point in time, because once the decision has been made, it's been made.
And if I were in their shoes, I'd be pissed off about it too. But if I knew I was being relocated to another planet where I'd be able to resettle and go on with my life more or less as it was, and that in exchange for me having to do that, we got to end a war, I think I could live with that. And though it may tarnish the Federation somewhat in my eyes, I'd also much rather continue to live under their rule of law than the Cardassians. Even in this highly evolved, prosperous, and generally just society, we see that there are occasions when the government has to make a decision that will place the long-term interests of everyone ahead of the immediate interests and happiness of a few. Is it ideal to force a group of people to leave
The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Where have we heard that before?
their homes? No. At best, it's regrettable. Even if you give them new homes and enable them to maintain the lifestyle and quality of life they enjoyed prior to the move, it's regrettable. But if you have to do that in order to end an interplanetary war, come on. In the grand scheme of things, I'd call that a fair trade. Viewed from this angle, the Maquis storyline is one of the relatively few examples from Star Trek of the show telling us one thing while it's showing us another. From the way characters both in and outside the Maquis talk, we're clearly meant to regard the Maquis as people caught in an impossible situation they didn't create, fighting back against the militant and aggressive Cardassians because Starfleet and the Federation have abandoned them.
But Starfleet, I don't know who's going to bring this up, didn't abandon them. They abandoned Starfleet. You could make that argument. Starfleet offered to take them to and relocate them to another planet, not just the Native Americans, the other planets that were on the Cardassian side, the Federation colonists. They were given an opportunity to leave. They did not take it. Okay, that's the other thing about this whole thing is, it can't stress it enough. They were given the opportunity to leave, but they did not do it.
But that's not the full story. The Federation offered to relocate them to new planets, an offer which, as far as I can tell, is never rescinded. If the former Federation colonists living on those planets that were ceded to the Cardassians want to move to other, safer planets outside of Cardassian territory, they can. Even now that they're under Cardassian jurisdiction, I'm sure between Starfleet, the Cardassians, and the ships the colonists themselves clearly have access to, a safe and orderly evacuation can be carried out. The Cardassians make it pretty clear that their intention isn't to trap and oppress or exploit the colonists, but to make life on those planets so inhospitable that they'll pack up and get the hell out. The Cardassians want them to leave.
Yeah, that is true. The Cardassians have no interest of having Federation colonists on their side. They don't trust the Federation. From their point of view, the Federation, letting them stay on their side of the demilitarized zone under Cardassian rule is just not feasible. They don't want them there. And that's why they react the way they do.
And if they do, once they're back in Federation space, they can look forward to being resettled somewhere else. The ones who actually join the Maquis might be in some trouble, but judging by what happens to Tom Paris after he's arrested and convicted of treason for working with the Maquis, it doesn't seem like they'd have to fear harsh punishment. New Zealand looks lovely. The Maquis are presented as antagonists for the most part, but sympathetic ones. The
other thing about the Maquis is that, and this is mentioned in Deep Space Nine, is the Maquis are sold on the belief that they can defeat the Cardassians and go back to their old lives. even if you push the Cardassians out of the demilitarized zone, if you think that they're going to just let you go right back to your life and live your life again since you just won a war, you're crazy. And again, the Maquis were sympathetic villains, but villains nonetheless. Again, it can't be discounted the fact that they had the opportunity to leave. I understand that they want to live where they are. I understand they don't want to give up their home. But the point is, you have an opportunity to leave and you're not taking it. You're choosing to live under Cardassian rule.
Opponents of Captain Sisko, though not quite enemies, with the exception of the subject of my previous video, Maquis leader Michael Eddington, who Sisko pretty clearly considers an enemy.
Sisko really does not like Michael Eddington, especially after what he did to him with the industrial replicators.
But like Eddington himself, the Maquis aren't the bad guys, but they aren't exactly the good guys either. It's easy and, I think, necessary.
And this is what Deep Space Nine did a great job of, is whenever you didn't have just the good guys on one side, the bad guys on the other. Even with the Cardassians and a lot of the other things that went on in even with the Dominion and so forth, there was always a little bit of self-doubt that it threw into you because they try to treat it as much as real life as you can in a science fiction soap opera.
To take their side in their fight against the Cardassians. But their conflict with the Federation is a lot more complicated. Their opposition to and disillusionment with the Federation is certainly understandable. But given the larger context in which the Federation makes its decision to give away those planets and attempt to relocate those colonies, and the fact that the Federation seems willing and able to make things right with the displaced colonists, short of violating the Cardassian Treaty, even after the Maquis begin using violent guerrilla tactics, their continued hostilities against the Federation start to seem unreasonable. Forced relocations are bad, and they carry a lot of ugly historical baggage. No one likes the idea of the government compelling them to leave their home. If government agents show up at your door and say, hey, you've got to leave, we just traded this area to a hostile country we've been at war with, of course you're going to think those government agents are assholes. But if they promise to move you to another town on their dime and buy you a new house just as nice as the one you have now, that's not a bad deal.
It really isn't a bad deal when you think about it, but you can see the gray area here. If you're living in your home and it's your home, you paid for it, and somebody knocks on your door and says, say you're living in Florida, and says, we're taking this home, this is your home, this is our home now, we're going to pack you up on our dime and move you to Montana. You're going to live there. There's a house there. It's a beautiful house. You may not want to do that, okay? You may not want to give up the sunshine of Florida and move to Montana, okay? Now, we're talking about different planets here, okay? So probably not the same, not a same apples to apples kind of argument, but it's the same thing. It depends on how you look at it. But the fact is, they are offering to move them to another planet. They're offering to move them to another planet on their dime, even though there's no money involved in this, and you can relocate. I think that is a good deal. It's not ideal because you have to give up where you are, where you want to be, and go someplace else, someplace you don't want to be. But to avoid living under oppressive rule versus living under a better freedom versus tyranny, it's not the worst thing.
If you factor in that moving out of your old house is one of the conditions necessary to end a war, it becomes an even better deal. And if you decide you'd rather stay in your old house and fight a hopeless battle against that hostile country and your own government, instead of taking that deal, there comes a point where you cease being a brave, principled freedom fighter and you become just another asshole. This video was commissioned by Keith Rout.
I can't really disagree a whole lot with that. he's right. The opportunity is there. If you're going to live there under their rule, okay, then you should follow their principles and guidelines. If they don't want you there, and they're making clear they don't want you there, then you're probably better off leaving. They have more guns than you do. They can destroy you, do whatever they want to you, because you made that decision. So you are actually better off leaving in that circumstance. It's not the best way it's presented on Deep Space Nine, Star Trek: The Next Generation, because that's not, because again, you know who the Cardassians are. And if you're a human being with with a third of a brain, do I live under Cardassian rule, under this authoritative rule? Do I trust them? Because if you do trust them, and they react the way they do, you shouldn't be surprised. And why would you pick up arms against them? Because not only are you starting a war with them, you're basically, as it turns out, starting a war with the government you just left. The Maquis, were they justified? I have to say, on my opinion, no, they were not justified. It was not the right thing to do. But then again, this is a writer's story. They wrote the story. They created the circumstances that you can. And like I said, I could be wrong with this. I'm not going to sit here and say that I'm 100% correct. If you don't think I'm right, that's fine. If you do think I'm right, that's fine too. But let me just finish up the video, and then I'll finish up myself.
Altenberg. Keith, I hope you think I did okay. Like I said, for me, it depends on how you read the Maquis. If you take them as a metaphor for actual groups that have resisted fascism and other types of overbearing government authority, then they're absolutely justified in what they do. If you take them literally within the world of the story, not so much. I'm not currently accepting new commissions, but when I am, I will definitely let you all know. In the meantime, if you want to support this channel, you can do so by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Steve Shives, becoming a channel member by clicking the join button on the YouTube page, or by making a one-time donation via PayPal or Venmo. The links for all of those are in the video description. And of course, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because that helps me out as well, and it's free. What do you think of?
Yeah, I think Steve Shives. If you find it, STEVESHIVES, hit a like on his. I'll put the original content in the description below. Put a like and subscribe on him, and put a like and subscribe on me as well. If you do so, I would appreciate it. I'm new at this, and this is one of my first Star Trek reaction videos. I mostly do soccer videos, or football videos, wherever you come from in the world. But yeah, I enjoyed this. Again, my thoughts are, depends on how you look at it. But if this was a real situation, would you live under an authoritative government? Would you live under a more benevolent government? That's up to you. But yeah, hit a like and subscribe if you like what I'm doing, and I hope to do more. And as far as Steve Shives is concerned, I hope you put a like and subscribe on him. I don't always agree with everything he says, but he definitely he does a lot of these videos, and they're very interesting to watch. But thank you very much. This is Scott signing off.